Stop resisting, son. Hands behind your back.
He's 15! Please, officer, you don't have to do this.
I just need to secure him, ma'am. Step back.
No, let him go!
Ma'am.
Enough!
Hey.
Don't touch my son again.
She dropped to her knees on the front porch, grabbing the legs of the ICE agent as he dragged her disabled son toward the unmarked vehicle, her scream shredding the quiet morning air of the residential street. 2 more agents shoved her backward onto the concrete, pinning her arms while her son, confused, terrified, unable to understand what was happening, cried out for the only person in the world who had ever protected him. What happened in the next 4 years would become courtroom legend, a story whispered about for decades. How one mother's refusal to stay silent turned a doorstep nightmare into a $16.8 million indictment of unchecked power. The ICE agent's boot was already on the front porch when Jelen Dorilis threw her body between the door and her son. She pressed both palms flat against the agent's chest and shoved, hard, her voice cracking into a scream that sent birds off the neighbor's fence. What happened in the next 72 hours would become South Florida legend, a story whispered about in courtrooms and immigration offices for years after. A black mother, 5'4", 130 pounds, standing between the full weight of the United States government and her disabled son, and winning. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you to Sunrise, Florida, a suburb west of Fort Lauderdale where the lawns are neat and the neighbors wave and nobody expects a raid before breakfast. Jelen Dorilis had lived in this country for over 20 years. She was a Haitian immigrant, a homeowner, a taxpayer, a mother of 3. Her oldest son, Wildly Dorilis, was 22 years old. He had severe intellectual disabilities, the kind where he couldn't dress himself some mornings, couldn't understand complex instructions, couldn't process what was happening when strangers showed up at the door wearing tactical gear and carrying guns. Believe me, that detail matters more than anything else in this story. It was a morning in 2017. Jelen was getting ready for work. She heard the knock, not a polite knock, the kind of knock that rattles the hinges. She came to the door and saw 4 Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents standing on her property. They weren't there for her. They had a target, her son. Wildly had been born in Haiti, brought to the United States as a child, and his immigration status had gotten tangled in bureaucratic wire over the years. But he wasn't a criminal. He had no record. He had no warrants. He had never been convicted of anything. He was a young man with the cognitive function of a child, living at home with his mother, completely dependent on her for daily survival. The lead agent stepped forward. "We're here for Wildly Dorilis." Jelen didn't step aside. She planted her feet. She grabbed the doorframe with both hands. "He's disabled," she said. "He doesn't understand what's happening. Please, you can't take him." The agent looked past her into the house. He didn't respond to what she said about the disability. He repeated the name. He said they had an order. Jelen's grip tightened on the doorframe until her knuckles went pale. Get this. They didn't have a judicial warrant. That's a critical fact. Under the 4th Amendment, ICE agents need a judicial warrant signed by a judge to enter a private home. What they had was an administrative warrant. That's a document signed internally within the immigration agency. It does not grant legal authority to enter someone's home without consent. Read that again. It does not grant them the right to come inside. Jelen did not know the legal terminology standing there on her porch that morning, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was not moving. "You are not taking my son." She said it once. Then she said it louder. Then she started pleading. She told them about Wildly's condition. She described his disabilities. She told him he couldn't survive alone, couldn't navigate a detention facility, couldn't advocate for himself, couldn't understand where he was or why he'd been separated from her. She was begging, tears running down her face, voice shaking, hands still locked on that doorframe. Here's what nobody tells you. It didn't matter. Not a single word she said changed anything. The agents pushed past her. They entered the home. They went inside, found Wildly in his room and put him in handcuffs. A 22-year-old man with severe intellectual disabilities, handcuffed in his own bedroom while his mother screamed from the hallway. Neighbors heard it. They came out onto their porches and sidewalks and watched as ICE agents walked Wildly Dorilis out the front door and loaded him into an unmarked vehicle. Jelen followed them onto the lawn, barefoot, still begging. One of the agents turned to her and told her to step back. She didn't step back. She followed them to the vehicle. She put her hands on the car door. Another agent physically moved her away. I swear this happened. They drove away with her son, just like that. No judicial authorization, no consideration for his disability. No acknowledgement that they had just ripped a profoundly vulnerable human being away from the only person on earth equipped to care for him. Gillen stood in her driveway and watched the vehicle disappear down the street. Her legs buckled. She dropped to her knees on the concrete. A neighbor ran over and grabbed her arm, tried to pull her up. Gillen couldn't speak. She just kept staring at the end of the road where the car had turned the corner. Now here's where the story could have ended. In thousands of cases across this country, it does end right there. The person gets taken, gets processed, gets detained, and the family scrambles to figure out what happened, often too late to do anything meaningful about it. The system is designed to move fast and leave people behind. That's not my opinion. That's the structural reality of immigration enforcement in the United States. But Jalen Dorilas was not built to be left behind. Within hours, she was on the phone. She called everyone she knew. She called community organizations. She called churches. She called legal aid offices. She called immigration attorneys. Most of them told her the same thing. These situations are complicated. It could take months. There's a process. Be patient. Gillen's jaw tightened every time she heard the word patient. Her son was sitting in a detention facility somewhere in South Florida, alone, unable to communicate his needs, unable to understand what was happening to him, surrounded by strangers in a place designed for adults who could advocate for themselves. Wildly was not that person. He would never be that person. Listen to me closely. This is where the real fight began. Gillen found attorneys willing to take her case, not ambulance chasers, not publicity hounds. Lawyers who looked at the facts and saw something that made their blood pressure spike. ICE agents had entered a private home without a judicial warrant. They had arrested a severely disabled person without any accommodation for his condition. They had ignored the pleas of a mother who explicitly told them her son could not care for himself. Every single one of those facts was a legal grenade. But getting Wildly out of detention was the first priority. The legal team filed emergency motions. They argued that Wildly's detention was not only unauthorized but actively dangerous to his health and safety. They presented medical documentation of his disabilities. They made the case that holding him in a standard immigration detention facility constituted a violation of his rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehabilitation Act. And while the lawyers were filing papers, Jalen was showing up. Every single day. She drove to the detention facility. She sat in the waiting room. She demanded visitation. She was turned away more times than she was let in. When she was turned away, she sat in the parking lot. She didn't leave. She brought food she'd cooked at home, hoping somehow she could get it to Wildly. Most days, she couldn't. Now, here's the part that makes my stomach turn. During the time Wildly was detained, his condition deteriorated. He wasn't receiving proper care. He wasn't receiving the level of attention his disabilities required. He was confused, frightened, and unable to communicate what he needed to the people around him. Detention facilities are not designed for individuals with severe cognitive disabilities. They're barely designed for anyone at all, but for someone like Wildly, it was a nightmare scenario brought to life. Gillen learned about his deterioration through the few visitation windows she managed to get. She sat across from her son, saw the weight loss, saw the fear in his eyes, watched him rock back and forth the way he did when he was overwhelmed. She reached across the table and held his hands. She told him she was going to bring him home. He didn't respond with words. He just held on. You need to understand something. This woman never stopped moving. Not for one day, not for 1 hour. Every single morning she woke up and the first thing she did was call someone. Her attorneys, her community contacts, local politicians, journalists, anyone who would listen. She became a one-woman campaign to get her son released and to make sure what happened to her family would never happen to another family. And slowly, the pressure built. The legal team secured Wildly's release after a period of detention that never should have happened in the first place. When Jelen drove to pick him up, she got out of the car before it fully stopped. She ran across that parking lot, and when Wildly came through the door, she wrapped both arms around him and didn't let go for a long time. He buried his face in her shoulder. He was thinner, he was shaking, but he was alive, and he was with his mother. That should have been enough. For most people, getting your child back would be the end. You'd hold your family close, lock the doors, and try to forget. Trust me on this. Gelen Doralus was not most people. She told her attorneys to keep going. She said, what they did was wrong, and somebody needs to answer for it. She didn't say it with rage. She said it flat, controlled, the way someone speaks when they've moved past anger into something harder and more permanent. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were dry. She was done crying. She was ready to fight. The lawsuit was filed in federal court. Gellin Dorilis and Wildly Dorilis versus the United States of America, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the individual agents who conducted the raid. The claims were devastating. Unlawful entry into a private home without a judicial warrant. Unlawful arrest. Violation of Fourth Amendment rights. Violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Violation of the Rehabilitation Act. Failure to provide reasonable accommodations for a detained individual with known disabilities. Negligence. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. The government's defense was what you'd expect. They argued the agents were acting within their authority. They argued the administrative warrant was sufficient. They argued they had no obligation to provide disability accommodations during an enforcement action. They argued sovereign immunity. They threw every procedural barrier they could find at this case, hoping one of them would stick. None of them stuck. Here's the thing about the law that people forget. It exists on paper, but it comes to life in courtrooms. And courtrooms are places where facts matter. And the facts in this case were brutal for the government. Fact 1. The agents entered the home without a judicial warrant. No judge had authorized that entry. The administrative warrant they carried did not give them legal permission to cross that threshold. Fact 2. They were explicitly told by the mother that her son was severely disabled. They ignored her. Fact 3. They detained a person with known disabilities in a facility that could not and did not provide appropriate care. Fact 4. They caused measurable documented harm to a vulnerable individual. Every one of those facts landed in that courtroom with the weight of a sledgehammer. The case moved through the system. Depositions were taken. Discovery was conducted. The agents had to sit in chairs and answer questions under oath about what they did that morning in Sunrise, Florida. They had to explain why they entered without proper authorization. They had to explain why they ignored a mother's desperate pleas about her son's condition. They had to explain what accommodations they provided for a detainee with severe intellectual disabilities. And here's where things got interesting. During depositions, something cracked. One of the agents, a lower-ranking member of the team, was asked directly whether he heard Gellin explain her son's disabilities. He paused. He looked at the table. Then he said yes. He said he heard her. He said he understood what she was telling them. And when asked why they proceeded anyway, he said it wasn't his call. He said the lead agent made the decision. But his voice dropped when he said it, and he wouldn't make eye contact with anyone in the room. That moment, right there, that was when the power shifted. Because once a member of the enforcement team admitted under oath that they knew about Wildly's disabilities before the arrest, the government's defense crumbled. You can't claim you had no obligation to accommodate a disability you were explicitly told about. That's not how the law works. That's not how anything works. The legal proceedings dragged on the way federal cases do. Months turned into longer stretches of time, motion after motion, filing after filing. But Gellin didn't waver. She showed up to every proceeding. She sat in the front row. She wore the same determined expression she'd worn on her porch the day they took her son. She didn't perform for anyone. She just sat there, present, visible, immovable. Mark this moment. The case went to trial. The facts were presented. The testimony was heard. And when it was all done, the jury came back with a verdict that sent shockwaves through immigration enforcement agencies across the country. $16.8 million. I'll say it again. $16.8 million. Awarded to Gellin Dorilis and Wildly Dorilis for what ICE agents did to their family on that morning in Sunrise, Florida. The jury looked at the evidence, listened to the testimony, measured the harm, and decided that what happened in that house and in that detention facility was worth every single dollar of that number. Let me break that verdict down because the number alone doesn't tell the whole story. The jury found that ICE agents violated the family's constitutional rights by entering the home without a judicial warrant. They found that ICE violated the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehabilitation Act by failing to provide reasonable accommodations for Wildly during his detention. They found that the arrest and detention caused severe emotional and physical harm to both Wildly and Gellin. They found that the government's conduct was not just negligent, but deliberately indifferent to the rights and safety of a disabled person in their custody. Deliberate indifference. That's a legal term, and it's a heavy one. It means the jury concluded that the agents didn't just make a mistake. They knew what they were doing, knew it was wrong, and did it anyway. When the verdict was read, Gellin was sitting in the courtroom. She didn't jump up. She didn't scream. She didn't celebrate. She closed her eyes. She put one hand flat on the table in front of her. She sat like that for a long moment while her attorneys shook hands and the courtroom buzzed around her. Then she opened her eyes, looked at her legal team, and said 7 words. My son deserved better than that. That's it. 7 words. No victory speech. No dramatic moment. Just a mother stating a fact so obvious it shouldn't have taken a federal lawsuit to prove it. Now, if this story has kept you here this long, you already know this channel tells the stories nobody else wants to tell the right way. Stories about people who stood up when the smart move was to sit down. If you want more of these, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, because these stories deserve to be heard, and I'm going to keep telling them. Let me tell you what happened after that verdict, because the ripple effects went far beyond one family's bank account. The Dorilas case became a landmark. Immigration attorneys across the country started citing it. Disability rights advocates held it up as proof that enforcement agencies could not treat disabled individuals as an afterthought. Community organizations in South Florida used it as a rallying point, educating immigrant families about their rights, specifically the right to refuse entry to ICE agents who don't have a judicial warrant. And here's something most people don't know. After the verdict, ICE issued internal guidance revising protocols for encounters involving individuals with known disabilities. They didn't hold a press conference about it. They didn't issue a public apology. But the policy changed. Quietly, internally, on paper, the way Jillian Dorilas was treated became a case study in what not to do. Her suffering became a manual for preventing future suffering. That's not justice in its purest form, but it's something. It means what she went through wasn't wasted. The money itself was significant, obviously. $16.8 million provides for Wildley's care for the rest of his life. It ensures he'll have access to the specialized support he needs. It means Gellin doesn't have to worry about what happens to her son when she's no longer around to fight for him. For a mother who spent every day of his life being his advocate, his protector, his voice, that financial security is worth more than any jury could calculate. But let me tell you what Gellin did in the months after the verdict. That tells you everything about who she is. She didn't disappear. She didn't take the money and retreat into privacy. She started speaking at community events, at churches, at legal clinics. She stood in front of rooms full of immigrant families and told her story, not for sympathy, for strategy. She told them, know your rights. Do not open the door. Ask to see a judicial warrant. If they don't have one signed by a judge, you do not have to let them in. She said it plainly, without legal jargon, in the language of a mother who learned these lessons the hardest way possible. People listened to her differently than they listened to attorneys, because she wasn't speaking from theory. She was speaking from the front porch where she'd thrown her body between her son and the government. You want to know what courage looks like? It doesn't look like what you see in movies. It doesn't wear a cape. It doesn't deliver monologues. It looks like a 5'4" Haitian mother in a suburb of Fort Lauderdale, barefoot on her lawn at 7 in the morning, screaming at armed federal agents that they cannot take her child. It looks like the same woman sitting in a courtroom 3 years later, calm, composed, eyes forward, refusing to stop until someone in authority acknowledged that what happened was wrong. And I need to tell you about Wildley, because in stories involving disabled individuals, the person at the center often gets reduced to their diagnosis. Wildley Dorilas was not a diagnosis. He was a person. He liked music. He had a laugh that filled a room. He recognized the people who loved him, and he responded to affection with affection. His disabilities were real, profound, and lifelong, but they did not define the entirety of who he was. They defined what he needed, and what he needed was protection, patience, and the presence of people who understood him. ICE agents stripped all of that away in a single morning. The physical and emotional effects of his detention lasted long after he came home. His behavioral patterns changed. His anxiety increased. He became fearful of strangers in a way he hadn't been before. The trauma of being taken from his home, restrained, placed in an unfamiliar environment, and denied the care he required left marks that no verdict could fully erase. That's the part of the story that keeps me up at night, because $16.8 million is a victory, and it's a significant one. But no amount of money gives Wildley back the sense of safety he had before that morning. No jury verdict restores the trust that was broken when men with badges walked into his house and took him away from his mother while she begged them to stop. I want you to sit with that for a second. Now let me zoom out, because this case didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened during a period of aggressive immigration enforcement across the United States. It happened when ICE was conducting operations in neighborhoods, workplaces, and homes with an intensity that alarmed civil liberties organizations nationwide. and it happened to a family that represented exactly the kind of people these operations were never supposed to target. Wildly Dorelis was not a criminal. He was not a threat to public safety. He was not a priority for removal by any rational standard of enforcement. He was a disabled young man living quietly with his mother in a residential neighborhood. The decision to target him for arrest reflected either a profound failure of judgment or a deliberate indifference to the human consequences of enforcement quotas. The jury's verdict suggested it was the latter, and that's what makes this case important beyond the Dorelis family. It established, with the authority of a federal jury, that enforcement agencies cannot operate without regard for the rights and vulnerabilities of the people they encounter. It said, in dollar amounts that demand attention, that there are consequences for treating human beings as numbers on a spreadsheet. Here's something else I want you to consider. Gelen Dorelis was a black immigrant woman. She existed at the intersection of every demographic that the American legal system has historically failed: black, female, immigrant, mother of a disabled child. On paper, she was the person least likely to win a fight against the federal government. The system was not designed for her to succeed. It was designed for her to be afraid, to be confused, to be overwhelmed, and to give up. She didn't give up. She didn't fold. She took the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country to federal court and walked out with a verdict that will be studied in law schools for decades. That is not just a legal victory. That's a testament to something that can't be measured in dollars. It's what happens when a parent's love for their child meets an immovable refusal to accept injustice. It's what happens when the system encounters someone it can't intimidate, can't exhaust, and can't silence. I want to go back to that morning one more time. I want you to see it clearly. The sun is coming up over Sunrise, Florida. Gelen is in her kitchen. Coffee is on the counter. Wildly is in his room. The day is supposed to be normal. Then the knock comes. The heavy knock. The one that changes everything. She opens the door. She sees the badges, the tactical vests, the guns on hips. Her stomach drops. She hears her son's name. And in that moment, every instinct she has fires at once. Not fight or flight, just fight. Because flight isn't an option when your child is behind you. She puts her hands on that door frame. She makes herself as wide as she can. She speaks, and her words come out raw and desperate and fierce. She tells them who her son is. She tells them what he needs. She tells them they cannot do this. And they do it anyway. They push past her. They walk through her home. They take her son, but they didn't take her fight. That stayed right where it was, locked in her chest, burning, waiting for the right arena. The courtroom became that arena. The law became her weapon. And $16.8 million became the number that told the world what Gelen Dorelis already knew. You don't get to do that to a mother's child and walk away clean. The agents involved in the raid faced professional consequences. The policies they operated under were revised. The precedent set by the jury's verdict created legal armor for families who would face similar situations in the future. None of that happened because the system corrected itself. It happened because one woman refused to accept what was done to her family and spent years pushing until the system was forced to respond. I've told a lot of stories on this channel. Stories about people who faced impossible situations and found a way through. But this one hits different. Because it's not about a fighter in a ring or an athlete on a field. It's about a mother in her house. It's about the most basic, primal, universal instinct a human being can have. Protect your child. And it's about what happens when that instinct meets a system that doesn't care about your child, doesn't see your child, doesn't account for your child's needs, and expects you to step aside. Gelen Dorelis did not step aside. She stood on that porch. She stood in that parking lot. She stood in that courtroom. And when the jury read out $16.8 million, she sat quietly with her hand on the table and said what she'd been saying since the beginning. My son deserved better than that. He did. And because his mother refused to stop fighting, the next disabled person detained by ICE might actually receive it. The next family targeted by an enforcement action at their home might know their rights. The next mother standing in a doorway might know that she doesn't have to move. That's what Gelen Dorelis built. Not just a legal victory, not just a financial settlement. She built a wall between her son and a system that tried to swallow him whole. And that wall is standing today. It's standing for her family. It's standing for families she'll never meet. And it's standing because one woman, on one morning, decided that no force on earth was going to take her child without a fight. Sunrise, Florida, a quiet suburb, a mother's scream, a $16.8 million answer. That's not just a verdict. That's a legend.